Charles Bronson discovered his mechanic was stealing from elderly customers. His revenge was perfect. The first time Charles Bronson noticed something was wrong was when he overheard Mrs. Eleanor Patterson crying on the phone outside Tony's auto repair shop. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March 1974, and Charles had brought his Mustang in for routine maintenance at the garage he'd been using for 3 years. Mrs. Patterson was maybe 70 years old, a widow who lived alone and drove a 1968 Plymouth that was probably older than some of Tony's employees. She was standing by the pay phone outside the shop, talking to what sounded like her daughter. "I know it seems like a lot of money, honey, but Tony says the transmission is completely shot. He says if I don't fix it, the car could break down anywhere and leave me stranded." Charles could hear her daughter's voice through the phone, though he couldn't make out the words. $1,800, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice breaking. "I know it's more than the car is worth, but I can't afford a new one. And Tony says he can give me a payment plan." Charles felt his attention sharpen. $1,800 for transmission work on a 26-year-old Plymouth seemed excessive, even in 1974 dollars. Mrs. Patterson hung up the phone and walked slowly back into the garage, looking defeated. Charles followed her inside, where Tony Castellano was waiting behind the counter with a clipboard full of paperwork. Tony was a third-generation mechanic who'd inherited the shop from his father. Charles had always found him to be honest and fair. Tony had never tried to sell Charles unnecessary work, and his prices had always been reasonable. But something about this situation didn't feel right. "Mrs. Patterson," Tony was saying, "like I explained, the transmission needs to be completely rebuilt. It's a big job, but we can spread the payments out over 6 months if that helps." "Tony," Charles interrupted, "can I take a look at Mrs. Patterson's car? I'm curious about this transmission problem." Tony looked surprised. "Sure, Charlie, but I don't think you'll be able to tell much just by looking. Transmission work is pretty specialized." Charles had grown up around cars and trucks in Pennsylvania coal country, where everyone learned basic mechanical skills out of necessity. He'd also played mechanics in several movies and had learned quite a bit about automotive repair during his research. Mrs. Patterson's Plymouth was up on the lift in the main bay. Charles walked around it, checking the transmission fluid, looking for leaks, listening to the engine idle. "Mrs. Patterson, can you describe the problem you've been having?" "Well, sometimes when I'm backing out of my driveway, it takes a moment for the car to go into reverse. Tony says that means the whole transmission is failing." Charles asked Tony to lower the car so Mrs. Patterson could demonstrate the problem. She got behind the wheel and put the car in reverse. After about 3 seconds, the car began backing up normally. Charles had seen this issue before. It was usually caused by low transmission fluid or a minor adjustment to the linkage. A $20 fix at most. "Tony, can I talk to you privately?" They walked to Tony's office, a small room cluttered with invoices and automotive manuals. "Tony, I've seen this exact problem before. This isn't a transmission rebuild, this is probably just low fluid or a linkage adjustment." Tony's face flushed. "Charlie, with all due respect, you're not a mechanic. I've been doing this for 15 years. I'm not questioning your expertise. I'm questioning your diagnosis. That car doesn't need $1,800 in transmission work." Tony was quiet for a moment, then his expression hardened. "Look, Charlie, I appreciate your concern, but this is my business. I know what I'm doing. Then show me the problem. Get under that car with me and show me exactly what's wrong with the transmission." Tony looked nervous. "I don't have time for that. I've got other customers waiting." Charles looked around Tony's shop. Mrs. Patterson was the only customer there. "Tony, level with me. What's really going on here?" Tony sat down heavily in his chair. "You don't understand, Charlie. Business has been terrible lately. The new chain stores are undercutting my prices, the economy's bad, and people are keeping their cars longer instead of buying new ones. So you're overcharging elderly customers to make up the difference. It's not like that. These old people, they don't know anything about cars. They're just happy to have someone take care of them. Mrs. Patterson can afford it, she lives in that big house on Maple Street. Charles felt his anger rising. Tony, that woman was crying on the phone because she can't afford your fake diagnosis. She's not wealthy, she's a widow living on Social Security. You don't know her situation. I know enough. And I know that what you're doing is fraud. Tony stood up, his own anger flaring. Don't lecture me about fraud, Charlie. You make more money in one movie than I make in 5 years. Easy for you to talk about honesty when you don't have to worry about paying the rent. Charles looked at Tony for a long moment. He'd liked the man, had considered him a friend. But friendship didn't excuse what was happening. Tony, you're going to fix Mrs. Patterson's car properly. No transmission rebuild, no $1,800. You're going to add some fluid, adjust the linkage if necessary, and charge her what the work is actually worth. And if I don't? Then I'm going to make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows that Tony's Auto Repair specializes in ripping off elderly customers. Tony's face went pale. Charles Bronson's endorsement had been valuable for his business. Several neighbors had started coming to Tony's shop because Charles recommended it. You'd ruin my business over one repair job? I'd ruin your business to protect Mrs. Patterson and every other elderly person you've been cheating. Charles walked back into the main shop, where Mrs. Patterson was sitting nervously in one of the waiting area chairs. Mrs. Patterson, good news. Tony took another look at your car, and it turns out the problem is much simpler than he originally thought. Tony came out of his office, looking defeated. That's right, Mrs. Patterson. Just need some transmission fluid and a minor adjustment. Should be about $40 total. Mrs. Patterson's face lit up with relief. $40. Oh, thank goodness. I was so worried about how I'd pay for the bigger repair. But Charles wasn't finished with Tony Castellano. Over the next few weeks, Charles made some calls to friends in the neighborhood. What he discovered made his blood boil. Tony had been systematically overcharging elderly customers for months. Mrs. Helen Morrison had been told she needed a new engine when she actually needed a $15 air filter. Mr. Frank Rodriguez had paid $800 for brake work that should have cost $200. Mrs. Dorothy Chen had been charged $1,200 for a complete electrical system overhaul when her problem was a loose battery cable. All of the victims were elderly, all of them trusted Tony because he seemed honest and knowledgeable, and all of them had been too intimidated to question his diagnoses. Charles decided to set a trap. He asked his friend Mickey Torino, a private investigator, to pose as the elderly uncle of Charles's assistant. Mickey was actually 45, but with the right makeup and clothing, he could pass for 70. Mickey took a perfectly good 1970 Chevrolet to Tony's shop, claiming it was making funny noises, and asking for a complete inspection. Charles waited across the street in his car, watching through binoculars as Tony looked over Mickey's Chevrolet. 2 hours later, Tony called Mickey with his diagnosis. The car needed extensive work to the engine, transmission, and electrical system. Total cost, $2,400. The car needed nothing more than an oil change. Charles had heard enough. He called Detective Ray Santos of the LAPD Fraud Division. Ray, I need to report systematic fraud targeting elderly victims. Charles provided all the evidence he'd gathered, including testimony from Mrs. Patterson and the other victims, plus the recorded phone call of Tony's fraudulent diagnosis of Mickey's perfectly good Chevrolet. Detective Santos was interested. Consumer fraud cases are hard to prosecute, but this sounds like we have enough evidence for criminal charges. The investigation took 3 months. Detectives interviewed dozens of Tony's customers and found a clear pattern. Young customers received honest diagnoses and fair prices, while elderly customers were systematically overcharged for unnecessary work. Tony Castellano was arrested and charged with multiple counts of consumer fraud and theft from elderly victims. The local media picked up the story, and suddenly everyone in Los Angeles was talking about automotive repair fraud. But Charles wasn't satisfied with just seeing Tony prosecuted. He wanted to make sure the elderly victims got their money back. Charles hired a lawyer and helped organize a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the customers Tony had defrauded. The lawsuit recovered over $50,000 in fraudulent charges, which was distributed among the victims. More importantly, the case led to new consumer protection laws in California. The state began requiring automotive repair shops to provide written estimates for all work over $100 and to allow customers to keep replaced parts as proof that the work was actually necessary. Tony Castellano eventually pleaded guilty to 15 counts of fraud and was sentenced to 2 years in prison plus restitution to his victims. His auto repair shop was closed permanently. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson used her settlement money from the lawsuit to buy a reliable used car that served her well for the next 10 years. She often told people that Charles Bronson had saved her from financial ruin. "I trusted Tony because he seemed so honest," she would say. "But Mr. Bronson showed me that some people will take advantage of your trust if you let them. He taught me that it's okay to ask questions and get second opinions." In 1995, 21 years after the Tony Castellano case, Charles was honored by the Better Business Bureau for his work in exposing automotive repair fraud. At the ceremony, he spoke about the importance of protecting vulnerable consumers. "The people who run these scams count on their victims being too trusting, too intimidated, or too embarrassed to fight back," Charles told the audience. "They target elderly people, single women, anyone they think won't question their authority." He paused, looking out at the crowd of consumer advocates and law enforcement officials. "But here's what they don't understand. When you hurt innocent people, when you steal from people who can't afford to lose money, you make enemies of people like me. People who have the resources and the determination to fight back." Charles Bronson died in 2003, but the consumer protection laws inspired by the Tony Castellano case are still in effect today. California's automotive repair disclosure requirements have been copied by dozens of other states and have saved consumers millions of dollars in fraudulent charges. At Charles's funeral, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, then 99 years old, was one of the speakers. "Charles Bronson saved me from losing my life savings to a dishonest mechanic," she told the assembled mourners. "But more than that, he made sure that other people wouldn't be victimized the same way I almost was." She looked out at the crowd with tears in her eyes. That's the kind of man Charles was. He didn't just help people. He changed the system so that help wouldn't be needed as much in the future. Today, the Eleanor Patterson Consumer Protection Center in Los Angeles helps elderly residents avoid scams and fraud. The center's motto comes from advice Charles gave Mrs. Patterson after the case was resolved: "Trust, but verify. And never be afraid to ask questions." Above the center's entrance is a photograph of Charles Bronson with these words: "In honor of a man who proved that the strongest people use their strength to protect the most vulnerable." That's the Charles Bronson story that should be remembered. Not just the vigilante movies, but the man who saw an elderly woman being cheated by someone she trusted and refused to let it happen. Because sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who rob you at gunpoint. Sometimes they're the ones who smile while they steal your money, who use your trust against you, who count on you being too polite or too scared to fight back. Charles Bronson understood that, and he made sure those criminals learned that their victims weren't as powerless as they thought.